Hi, everyone. This is Suzanne Simon with Restore America's Estuaries. Thank you very much for joining our Living Shorelines community of practice today. Since you're on the call, you've already gotten the agenda, so we're going to go ahead and get going. So a few housekeeping notes to start. Everyone is on mute. Please use the webinar control panel to raise your hand virtually, or use the webinar control panel to submit a question. All of these webinars to date have been recorded and are in the process or already on the Ray YouTube channel. I am happy to report that we have gotten the older ones up and they're there, so please let some of your colleagues know. I know there have been a number of questions on that front. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I would like to take a moment to introduce Restore America's Estuaries. We are an organization with 10 member groups. You can see there on the map, and we are dedicated to protection, restoration of bays and estuaries as essential resources for our nation. So thank you for all of you again who are just joining us. We're just getting started. Some quick national updates before we get into the meat of it. There was a Marsh resilience workshop, and I'll ask Katie to reference this a little bit. This is just a prompt for me to report out on this. So there were some very interesting findings as it relates to living shorelines on that. Other national updates. We are still working on the 2019 Living Shorelines Workshop. We are still aiming to be in North Carolina this fall. Stay tuned. I know we've been saying that for a while, and for those of you who have been unable to join us in the past, due to extensive damage to multiple venues as a result of Hurricane Florence, it's been a little tricky, but we're crossing our fingers. We've lined up a new venue and are hoping to have contracts signed shortly. So once that happens, please keep your eyes peeled for additional information. Also, as it relates to our 2018 summit, the proceedings for both presentations and posters are on the Ray website. And for those of you who are unable to join us, we had over 50 Living Shorelines oral presentations, and I think 20 or 30 posters. So there's a lot of really fantastic information about living shorelines and nature-based approaches to stabilization and protection. So anybody with other national updates, raise your hand virtually, please, using the control button, and I will unmute you. Okay, any regional updates folks would like to talk about? I know there's a lot of interesting stuff going on as it relates to, particularly in the Gulf, anything, and it's totally fine if you don't want to report out. Okay, oh, here we go. Kate Bimrose, I am going to, okay, there you go, go for it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Kate.
Great. I just wanted to say really quickly, I am calling from San Francisco, and I'm working with our local National Estuary Research Reserve and the State Coastal Conservancy to put together 2 Living Shorelines workshops here that are regionally based for the North Central California coast. We're doing one that's focused on San Francisco Bay, and then another that is focused on the outer coast region. So those will be held March 1st and April 2nd. And they're sort of hand-selected invite only. We want to really invite folks in the area that are practitioners from all different topics related to living shorelines. So anywhere from community members to engineers, ecologists, even reaching out to some of the contractors who actually go out and do some of the work on the ground. So it'll be informational, capacity building, and hopefully really great for some networking in order to advance living shorelines concepts in the area.
Great, thank you, and best of luck, and let us know if you need any help with the It sounds like it's invite only, but if you wanted to help get the word out, just let us know.
Okay, thank you.
Alrighty, thanks, Kate. Alrighty, and thanks to those of you who have let me know that you could hear my melodious voice, but I had forgotten to show my screen, so sorry about that. The good news is we haven't gotten that far in the agenda, so we're in good shape. So any other questions about, or comments, I should say, on any updates around the country, either national, regional, announcements, questions? Yes, Marilyn Latta with the California Coastal Conservancy. You should be good to go.
I just wanted to give a quick update. I spoke last year about our creosote removal work at the Red Rock site in Richmond, and then we did a field trip as part of the February tech transfer workshop, and we constructed our oyster reefs at that site in September of 2018, and we do have oyster recruitment, so just wanted to report on that good news. That we're starting to gather monitoring data and seeing multiple age classes of Olympia oysters out there. And then just the second announcement is we're making it through a long permitting and fabrication process and finally about to construct our giant Marsh living shoreline site also in Richmond. So, and that project includes a variety of habitat treatments, including Pacific cordgrass plantings, oyster and eelgrass reefs offshore, and upland ecotone treatments in the design. So would be happy to chat more about either of those projects if folks are interested.
That's great. Thank you. I have actually a comment and a question. The comment is, I believe that one is already up on the Ray YouTube channel if you want to go back and revisit it for those who are interested. And Marilyn, to what degree were community members involved? I know Richmond has a fairly substantial, typically underrepresented population, if I recall correctly. So I'm curious as to if and how folks were involved.
Yeah, we've made a lot of efforts in terms of public outreach and engagement in welcoming input on the design, but the Red Rock site is actually off limits to the public. It's a pretty industrialized site that's owned by the Port of Richmond, so we weren't able to actually involve volunteers on site. With our giant marsh project, which is just up the shoreline and managed by East Bay Regional Parks, we're hopeful to have a bit more public involvement, but again, our treatments are about 300 meters offshore, so it's harder with our tide regime out here to get folks out in the water. But we've done a ton of presentations at a variety of museums and different estuarine networks, a lot of press, so other types of public outreach to raise awareness.
Oh, that's fantastic. Nicely done. I know it can be hard in some of those industrial sites, and I know that's one of the challenges, right? You need to thread that needle. So that's great. Congratulations.
Thanks.
All righty. Thank you. Any other updates or report outs or anything along those lines? All right. Hearing none, and then if anything comes up along the way, feel free to, as I mentioned earlier, use the control panel to raise your hand virtually or to submit a question or comment, and I am happy to act as a host and get those out incorporated into the webinar. So, oopsie, hang on, we just had a question come in. So someone just asked earlier, someone asked about the proceedings. So for the 2018 summit that we had in Long Beach, I happened to mention earlier that the proceedings are available, both presentations and posters. What I can do is and somebody asked where exactly they are. We just are in the process of launching a new website. I think they're on the old website. If you go to estuaries.org, 2018 summit, and I think they're on the program page, but I will make a note to include a specific link with the next update and information on the Living Shorelines community practice so folks can find it. So thank you for that question. Alrighty, now, all right, yes, apparently they are in fact on the program page. So there you go. Without further ado, I would like to turn to our focus topic and Q&A. which is entitled Legal and Policy Tools to Mitigate the Impacts of Coastal Squeeze on Wetlands, be given by Katie Spidalieri, who is an Institute Associate at the Georgetown Climate Center. She provides legal and policy analyses on adaptation projects at the federal, state, and local levels, with an emphasis on coastal law and policy. Kate is leading the Climate Center's work to develop an online managed retreat toolkit. She previously worked for NOAA in permitting, environmental compliance, policy, and the place-based management of the National Marine Sanctuaries and Marine National Monuments. So, without further ado, I will be handing off the screen to Katie so she can take it away. Katie, are you there? There we go. And Katie, I think you might still be on mute.
Hi, this is Katie. Can you all hear me?
There you go. Yes, we can see your computer and we can hear you.
That's what. Apologies. I am inept at technology sometimes and accidentally hung up myself. So now I'm back. All right.
All good.
All right. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, thanks, Suzanne, for the introduction, and good day, everyone. Before I get started with today's presentation, I will say, if people are interested after my presentation, I'm happy to talk about the Marsh Resilience Summit that Suzanne mentioned. Basically, the Chesapeake Bay Sentinel Site Cooperative in the Chesapeake Bay region recently held a summit pulling together community members, scientists, and other policy and related managers in the Chesapeake Bay region to look at the impacts of sea level rise on sort of marsh viability along coastlines, and wants to try and pull together a dialogue and a community of practice to look at examining this question more broadly. So it was very timely for looking at what we're talking about today, but also it examined the role of living shorelines in promoting the viability of wetlands on the coast, and also how they can support inland wetland migration. So happy to answer questions on that as well. And that leads us into today's presentation. So thanks for the opportunity to talk today and looking at things from a legal and policy angle. As many of you may be aware, coastal squeeze is the phenomenon or idea that intertidal habitats are ultimately being threatened by climate change impacts like sea level rise, flooding, and loss of land due to extreme coastal erosion. And when these habitats ultimately may be able to migrate inland, they're being prevented from doing so by different developmental barriers, whether that's residential or commercial development. Today, we're going to be looking at some legal and policy tools that can ultimately look at removing some of those barriers of development to basically facilitate the inland migration of these habitats. When you're thinking about living shorelines, often you may think about sort of what happens most closely to the shore when you're thinking about constructing or installing or managing these projects over the long term. But today's focus isn't just looking at sort of what's happening in regards to living shorelines themselves, but looking at the long-term viability of living shorelines that may be installed in response to threats like sea level rise, so that way they can help adapt to the impacts that they may be encountering. With that, you'll see some specific examples where I will highlight where living shorelines play a role, but where I'm not specifically calling that out, it's sort of looking at sort of this other side of the coin, where how you can look further inland to see what sort of land use decisions can complement living shorelines. With that, we'll get started, but I'm just going to be a stereotypical lawyer for one moment and just say that the information I'm providing today is for informational purposes only and should not be constituting legal advice in any capacity. So if you have questions like that, please consult your own counsel. Okay, hold on one second. This isn't, there we go. So I work for Georgetown Climate Center. We are a climate law and policy resource for state and local governments. We're actually celebrating our 10th anniversary this year, and this week specifically. We work both in the areas of mitigation in regards to the transportation sector and power sector, and also in adaptation. And we ultimately further the goal of being a resource to state and communities through providing a variety of services, including providing resources on different case studies or best practices through our online adaptation clearinghouse, and also helping to inform different policy recommendations at the federal, state, and local level. we're located with Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. So when you think about the idea of where living shorelines are along the coast and often in a state's jurisdiction to where they may be migrating in a local jurisdiction, the purpose of this slide is to think about the multitude of players that are involved in sort of these policy decisions and scientific decisions, and also the different laws and policies that come into play that you have to think about. So when you're thinking about living shorelines, you may often be in sort of a state's jurisdiction and be considering living shoreline laws, wetland laws, coastal zone management laws. But then if you're talking about where wetlands or other coastal ecosystems may be moving, you may be moving into local government's jurisdiction, which is further inland and upland, where you'll also have to think about whether other zoning and land use ordinances apply as well. And then the federal government, although it's typically more in an outshore habitat, could also have jurisdiction over different resources in the state and local boundary lines as well. So long story short, the takeaway for this slide is that when you're considering creating living shorelines and also promoting their viability to migrate inland, you want to consider the host of players and potential laws and policies that may factor into the decisions that you're putting together. So from there, we're going to talk about some different state and local tools that get at these concepts. So first, we're going to take a look at two different types of land acquisition programs at the state level. First, we're going to talk about land acquisitions in terms of mitigating hazard reduction or risk, like from hurricanes. In New Jersey, the state's Blue Acres program is a unique example of a long-running state buyout program. It started in 1995 and is moving beyond the concept of what a traditional buyout program could be viewed as for purposes of really just acquiring title to a person's property, demolishing a structure, and then moving on, but to thinking comprehensively about how the piece of land that's left behind is managed. On the screen, this is a photo of Fawn McGee, who's the program's director, standing on the site of the state's first coastal buyout program in Woodbridge, New Jersey. And the state is partnering with different entities like Rutgers University to look at comprehensively managing the land that is left behind from the buyouts for purposes of promoting benefits for the community, to increase surrounding property values, to provide recreational opportunities, and also different flood resilience and ecosystem benefits. I'm not sure to the extent to which living shorelines are being incorporated into this particular project, but they're looking to not use hard shoreline armoring methods, and basically is an example of how you can physically remove development out of the way, but then you need to think long-term about what's left behind. The second example of a land acquisition program, in addition to one for hazard reduction purposes, is thinking about how a state may acquire lands for purposes of open space or recreation and would manage the land accordingly, as for instance, this was trails or forests or for other conservation purposes. In New York State, the state has a legally mandated plan called its Open Space Conservation Plan that ultimately acts as a blueprint for land conservation purposes. The plan, among its goals, includes addressing climate change as a goal and planning objectives for protecting lands through buyouts or conservation easements that would ultimately accommodate shifting wetlands and other wildlife species movements in response to sea level rise. So with this, it basically focuses the state's efforts for not just looking at what's on the coast and a most immediate threat to potential threats like sea level rise, but where are these habitats ultimately going? Maryland also has a great example of sort of looking at strategically planning for open space land acquisitions. It has a map called Greenprint that ultimately looks at wetland adaptation areas, where are these further inland areas where living shorelines and other habitats may be migrating, so it can prioritize future investments in land. I wanted to highlight both examples of land acquisition with hazard mitigation benefits and also for open space conservation purposes, because often at the state level, these are administered separately by different agencies and they have different sources of funding. But from the ecosystem or natural resources perspective, it's good to think about how the two could be leveraged to facilitate benefits for coastal ecosystems that are migrating. So transitioning from some state examples of tools to the local government. In the state of Florida, the state passed a law that essentially allows local governments to create overlay districts called Adaptation Action Areas, where the local government can apply increased management, attention, and investment authority to try and further some type of adaptation purpose. Typically, these have been used for looking at where the local government may want to prioritize like infrastructure investments, whether those are green or gray. The town of Yankeetown in Florida is a small rural town that has a lot of salt marshes and forests and depends on its environment for promoting ecotourism and deriving economic benefit from that. Yankeetown used adaptation action areas uniquely by not looking at them for purposes of facilitating infrastructure investments, but by taking a look at how the future development could be directed to promote the inland migration of these habitats in response to saltwater intrusion. So essentially, the local government passed or created the Natural Resource Adaptation Action Area, which is an overlay district over 86% of the town, where the local government will look at potential development cited within this overlay district and ultimately think about whether or not that development really has to be there or could be prohibited. And if it is allowed, thinking about how that development can be used in cooperation with the natural environment by either making those structures elevated so they wouldn't interfere with marsh migration, or look at how those structures could be relocated over time to the extent that they would act as a barrier to marsh migration coming inland. In the county of Kauai in Hawaii, the county has one of the nation's most stringent setback requirements. The county ultimately commissioned a science-based shoreline erosion control study to look at what the rate of erosion was along the coast in response to coastal threats like tsunamis and sea level rise, with a particular emphasis, again, on erosion. As a result of that study, the county passed an ordinance that requires that all new development be set back a minimum of 40 feet from the shoreline, plus 70 to 100 times the annual rate of erosion, depending on whether the size of development and the total square footage is either smaller or bigger. And so this is a way that you can think about having development being compatible with living shorelines and wetland or coastal ecosystem migration, because development is still being allowed. It's just being placed back further from the vulnerable coastal areas, giving the ecosystems more of an ability to move inland and interact with the natural environment without being blocked off. The last example we'll look at is a coastal armoring restriction in East Hampton, New York. East Hampton passed a coastal hazard overlay district that basically looked at the potential for living shorelines or coastal armoring along its entire shoreline. And basically, the local government looked at two factors to create this overlay district. One, whether its coast was facing the ocean or the bay. And two, looking at sort of the condition of natural resources in each area. And that was sort of based on whether there had been a history of hard armoring structures in that area or not. Ultimately, the coastal overlay zone is divided into 4 different districts, where hard structures are prohibited in 3 of those districts and only allowed in 1. And the one that the coastal armoring is allowed in is because that area has historically had a lot of coastal armoring structures, and basically that's the last form of defense or protection for the coastal habitats that are still present. So this is a good example of how one local government can look at things from not a one-size-fits-all approach and tailoring, the actual regulation to the actual environment for purposes of benefiting the ecosystems, even if in some contexts like here that ultimately resulted in permitting or continuing to permit hard structures. All right, so getting back to sort of that first slide that looked at sort of the different roles and players, underlying all of these different tools and policy decisions, it's good to think about bringing lawyers and policymakers into discussions earlier rather than later for purposes of making sure that the scientific decisions that you're making, hopefully they'll have community support, but they're also legally feasible. This slide just puts a high-level framework in terms of what questions you should be thinking and talking to your attorneys and policymakers about when going forward with these decisions. The first question is really whether at the state or local level, do you have the authority to do what you actually want to do? So in East Hampton, does East Hampton have the authority under state law to be able to create an overlay district? If that authority is already there and doesn't have to be asked for or through new policy or legal amendments, the second question is whether the action that you're ultimately taking is going to be compliant with state and federal laws. So on this slide, I include some, in addition to thinking whether that decision is compliant with living shorelines laws and regulations. And then the third question is whether the action is going to be comporting with constitutional law at both the federal level and the state level. Most often in these questions, the Fifth Amendment taking clause comes up, which ultimately prohibits the government from, quote unquote, taking private property for public use or purpose without just compensation. And there are ways that governments can minimize their potential takings liability, but it's important to consult federal law and law within your own state to see what those potential ramifications should be, because it varies across state to state and dependent on an individual fact pattern. Georgetown Climate Center is in the midst of developing what we're calling a managed retreat toolkit, which will be available online for for state and local governments. And the idea behind this toolkit is to put together a legal and policy decision-making framework and feature case studies of jurisdictions that are considering or implementing managed retreat strategies as one way to adapt to threats from climate change like sea level rise, but not as the only, but to sort of fill a gap where information is needed. The idea is that this toolkit will include information featuring planning tools and other examples like we've hit on today about the state and local levels, but also look at how holistic decision-making can be promoted, including for purposes of enhancing ecosystem management and facilitating the inland migration of coastal ecosystems. So the toolkit will feature opportunities for where living shorelines can be incorporated, and also then, again, looking at that opposite side of the coin for where barriers to that inland migration can potentially be mitigated or removed. If anyone is interested in hearing about the toolkit or providing any sort of case studies or insight into it, feel free to contact me. As I said, the toolkit is currently in development, and we look forward to releasing it at the end of 2019 or early 2020. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Katie. That was lovely. So why don't we leave that slide up so folks can have your email and contact information. And now is the chance for you, our attendees, to raise your hand virtually, and I will unmute you, or you can submit a question via the webinar control panel that you have. There are a couple of things, Katie, that I would appreciate additional clarification on. Kind of in the larger context, in your experience and in developing the toolkit, what have been the biggest challenges to manage retreat? In other words, when a community or jurisdiction is looking to think about this, what have been the traditional stumbling blocks in getting this incorporated as a concept?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, Suzanne. I'll say the two, I think, most common concerns that rise to the top, we've been engaging in a lot of outreach with different stakeholders and experts. I think number one is being able to incorporate communities into this decision-making process, not just because, if you're conducting buyouts like in New Jersey or acquiring open space like in New York, but if you're doing something like a setback in Kauai. It's important that people understand the impacts and threats that they're facing along the coast and can be informed about what potential decision-making options are so they can inform that at the state and local levels. The second thing I will say, particularly from the ecosystems or living shorelines perspective, is I think a lot of decision-making is very siloed, particularly in the natural resources context. And so the extent to which the natural resources and the parks department can work together with the land use and the emergency managers to work holistically on creating adaptation decisions that potentially include managed retreat as a part of that strategy where it's appropriate. I think it's important that the silos are dismantled and everyone is talking to one another.
I think that's good advice in general. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another question that came in, I think it was a clarification. I believe you said that the toolkit was going to be released at the end of this calendar year, 2019. Is that correct?
Yes, we're shooting for the end of 2019 or early 2020. But if you want more accurate updates or things like that, feel free to email me and I can include you on a list of people that we can inform about that.
Great. And so the next question is sort of related to my first one, which is, and I think they're probably related, but the reception of the idea of managed retreat. When you and I were preparing for this webinar, I shared with you a conversation where I was sitting in a room of coastal professionals, and I said, well, how are you incorporating managed retreat? And they all looked at me and they said, what do you mean? And then someone, and I will be very careful here and say someone with the State Department of Transportation laughed. They said, it's not like we can move roads or anything. So in general, how do you see the concept of managed retreat being embraced or not as we think of this as an adaptation?
Mm-hmm. Let's see. So that is ultimately, I think, where the sticking point is for a lot of jurisdictions, given the complexity of these questions, particularly because could be relocating, someone's actual home where they've established their life. They have a community there. They have ties. They have potentially like cultural and historical traditions and character. These decisions aren't just about, putting a law on the books and that's it. That's why with the toolkit, we're trying to get at these different considerations, not just for ecosystems, but communities. So there's a lot of different social, cultural, equity, historical dynamics to it as well. I think that often make it difficult to sort of start the discussion. In addition, there's a lot of federal laws and institutional or private sector factors at play as well. Looking at sort of potential prices of real estate in coastal areas, which tends to be high and maintains a strong value, or looking at, national flood insurance policies. So there's a lot of different other elements too in the policy world that have to be addressed. So I think across the board, it's really about communities being ready to start the discussion and using sort of the right tools to be able to engage the communities and really make this a bottom-up process, but while also looking to the state and federal government for support. In research from what I've seen, there are some communities that are actively talking about this, or at the state level as well. Louisiana, which is the jurisdiction within the U.S. that's experiencing the highest rate of coastal land loss and sea level rise, they have different planning practices in mind to start moving on these discussions and looking at long-term investments along the coast versus further inland for people and ecosystems to migrate. California as well is having some of these discussions in Hawaii. Other places may not be at that point yet, but they may be in the stages of sort of planning or thinking about how they can potentially bring this to their decision makers and communities as is appropriate as sort of the opportunity presents itself. I think particularly in a pre-disaster or proactive planning context versus being reactive and only thinking about this after a disaster like a hurricane or a tsunami hits.
Right, and human nature is often that you don't want to think about it until you have to. So I think getting out in front of it is ideal, but I think the reality is often that folks don't like to think about it. Can you, another question has come in, can you back up to your toolkit page that has sort of the various, there we go. So is this all going to be solely online, and are there going to be workshops or other in-person opportunities?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So the toolkit itself will be available in an online format. This enables us to do two things. One, sort of as the law and policy decisions and case studies evolve on managed retreat, we can keep the toolkit updated on that, so people will hopefully have the most up-to-date information. And two, as I mentioned earlier, Georgetown Climate Center maintains an adaptation clearinghouse, which is a one-stop shop for thousands of adaptation resources, which is sort of a curated list of different programs, plans, laws, policies, and tools that people in this area or the space may want to consider. So we're able to link to this clearinghouse to provide people with additional information on what may not be in the toolkit itself. Once the toolkit is released, we plan to work with partners like the Coastal States Organization to host some different webinars to introduce people to the toolkit and let them know what content is there and sort of how to maximize their use of it. I do not know if we would have sort of any in-person events, but definitely we do have a plan to educate people about the fact that the toolkit is out and sort of how they can maximize their use of it and what content is in it.
Mm-hmm. And the typical user, your target audience for this, is it planners? I mean, who's the audience for the most part?
Mm-hmm. So the audience would be particularly decision makers or policy makers at the state or local levels. With that said, though, again, the idea is trying to draw people with different expertise to the toolkit, because this should sort of promote holistic decision making in these adaptation decisions. So ideally, it wouldn't just be for planners or emergency managers, but also attract, natural resource managers, parks managers, community development organizations, the lawyers, that type of thing, to be able to have a little bit of something for everyone, because they all should have a seat at the table.
Gotcha. Great. Another question. So you touched on some of the overlays, like within East Hampton, where they have mandated that folks basically, I'm paraphrasing here, they have to look at living shorelines. And I'm not a lawyer. So in some of these other buyout scenarios, how would a community either incentivize or incorporate living shorelines or softer approaches into these buyout plans?
Mm-hmm. So one thing I think I should mention, if I didn't earlier, is that the examples that I was looking at and that I'm aware of and have been studying are voluntary buyout examples. So the community is working with the local government compared to like eminent domain or condemnation or involuntary buyout procedures. So New Jersey is a good example, because there has been a lot of community engagement for purposes of proceeding with the buyout that I talked about in Woodbridge. And it's on such a large scale that it makes this sort of ecosystem restoration possible, compared to if you had sort of one-off or checkered properties. And so I think for purposes of incorporating living shorelines into these restoration projects, it's about sort of working from the top down and the bottom up. Being able to work from the bottom up to have comprehensive plans that go forward in terms of the scale and size of the voluntary properties that are being bought out, and being able to also work and understand what's possible at the state level. Or there are also local examples of buyout programs as well, where the state would be integrated into not just the physical buyout and demolition of the property, but know that the community has interest in looking at living shorelines for other community benefits over the long term, and seeing what role the state would play in that, or the local government, and where that funding would come from. In addition, I think you can look beyond just the people whose properties are being bought out, but look at broader interest in the community in general, because obviously living shorelines provide a variety of ecosystem, flood resilience, aesthetic, etc. benefits that remaining community members could use to sort of rally to incorporate that into the buyout process. But I think it's really sort of driven at the local level and then sort of the state level, having people come to meet, because often with buyouts, there will be open space restriction requirements after a home is demolished. So future development may be prohibited. But I think for purposes of getting living shorelines in there, that's not something that would be mandated or regulated. So really, driving that discussion with people who care about seeing that in the community.
Great. Thank you. Let's see. Any other questions or comments on the part of the attendees? Again, for those of you listening in, please go ahead and either raise your hand or submit a question virtually through the control panel. Okay, hearing none. Thank you, Kate. I'm going to go ahead and take back the screen. And there we go. So if you have any questions for Katie, her information is up there once again. And if you have any questions for me, by all means, please email me. As a reminder, I am always looking for suggestions of topics and speakers for this series. For those of you who haven't joined us in the past, and it looks like there are some new folks, we do our best to cover pretty much everything and anything within the living shoreline spectrum, from outreach to implementation, obviously, to policy and legal aspects. science, you name it. We do definitely try to cover it. If you think it'll be interesting to you, it will likely be interesting to a lot of other people as well. So please do not hesitate to get in touch. Our next community practice will be March 20th at 1 p.m. Eastern. It is typically the third Wednesday in each month at this time. April, we're still working out some of the details on that one, so I will make that one known because it's break for a lot of people. So on that note, thank you, Katie, very much again. Thank you all for joining us, and I will look forward to hearing from you and seeing you, hopefully virtually, in March. Have a great one. Take care.